My name is Jeremy Harris, and I'm 34 years old. This happened in November, deep in Chippewa National Forest, Minnesota. I was alone on what was supposed to be a week-long research trip for my job as a wildlife biologist. What I experienced out there is something I still can't explain. I'm sharing this because someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know the truth about what's in those woods. I had driven my RV up to a remote site near Pimmy Lake, far from the usual tourist trails. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of weather that made me feel alive. I'd been studying declining wolf populations in the area and had planned to set up motion-triggered cameras along the trails. Wolves were elusive, but I'd always had patience. Alone time in the wilderness was something I craved, and it had never bothered me before. But from the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The first night was uneventful, though colder than I expected. I woke in the middle of the night to silence, not the usual peaceful stillness of the woods, but an oppressive, unnatural silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just jumpy from the long drive, but the feeling lingered. The second night, my RV's generator failed. I had plenty of fuel, but it simply wouldn't turn on. I fiddled with it for hours to no avail, eventually resorting to candles and my headlamp. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, thick and heavy. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. A low growl, distant but distinct. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the bark of a coyote. It was deeper, almost guttural. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the shadows. Nothing moved. Probably just a bear, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow in the quiet. The next morning, I found tracks near my campsite. They were massive, clawed prints sunk deep into the earth. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear, but the spacing was all wrong, too far apart, as if whatever made them walked on two legs. Later that day, I met Henry. I'd gone for a hike to clear my head and stumbled upon his RV, parked in a small clearing about a mile away. He was outside chopping wood, his grizzled face set in a permanent scowl. "Didn't think anyone else was camped this far out," I said, trying to sound casual. Henry looked up, his eyes sharp and wary. "Not many people. Too quiet out here for most folks." I laughed nervously. "That's why I like it." He set down his axe and wiped his hands on his pants. "You shouldn't be here," he said bluntly. I frowned. "Why not?" Henry glanced toward the trees, his expression darkening. "This forest. It's not right. People vanish out here, hear things they shouldn't. You do well to pack up and leave." I wanted to ask more, but his tone made it clear he wasn't interested in conversation. Still, his words stuck with me as I made my way back to my campsite. That night, things escalated. I woke to a strange sound, like someone whispering just outside the RV. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by the same low growl I'd heard the night before. This time, it was closer, much closer. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept by my bed and slowly opened the RV door. The forest was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. My flashlight's beam flickered as I swept it across the campsite. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness just beyond the tree line. They were too high off the ground to be wolves, and too far apart to be anything I could recognize. My breath caught, and I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. The next morning, I found Sasha. I'd driven into the forest farther than I should have, hoping to outrun whatever was happening. Instead, I came across her alone, sitting on a rock near a trailhead, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Are you okay?" I asked, pulling over. Sasha looked up, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "I'm lost," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been walking for hours. I can't find the trail back." I offered her a ride, and she climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her pack like a lifeline. She seemed jittery, her eyes darting toward the trees as if she expected something to jump out at any moment. "What happened?" I asked as we drove. Sasha hesitated, then whispered, "I heard someone calling my name. I thought it was my brother, but he wasn't here. I kept hearing it, though, over and over." That night, the Wendigo came. Henry had warned me earlier that day when we ran into him again. "It's the hunger," he said, his voice low and grim. "That thing preys on the lonely, the lost. You hear it calling your name, you don't answer. You see it in the trees, you run." I didn't understand how literal his warning was until it was too late. Sasha and I had parked near a ranger station, hoping to find help in the morning. We were both exhausted, but neither of us could sleep. The air was bitterly cold, colder than it should have been for October. Frost coated the inside of the RV windows, and then the whispers started again. "Jeremy." My name, faint but insistent, came from the woods. "Don't listen," Sasha hissed, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, gripping the knife tightly. The whispers grew louder, joined by the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. And then we saw it. The creature was emaciated, its limbs impossibly long, its pale skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a grotesque mask, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its head tilting slowly as it watched us. "Run," I whispered, pushing Sasha toward the door. We bolted into the forest, the Wendigo's guttural growl echoing behind us. It moved unnaturally fast, its movements jerky and inhuman. Henry saved us, or tried to. He appeared out of nowhere, his rifle aimed squarely at the creature. "Go," he shouted. "I'll hold it off." We didn't argue. Sasha and I ran, the sound of gunshots ringing out behind us, but the growls didn't stop. When we reached the RV, Henry was gone. There was no sign of him, no sound but the wind rustling through the trees. Sasha and I escaped the forest the next morning, driving straight to the nearest ranger station. The rangers didn't believe us, of course. They wrote it off as stress or exhaustion, saying Henry had likely been attacked by a bear. But I know the truth. Some nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I hear it again, my name whispered in the dark, and I know it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. Red River Gorge felt like the perfect escape, a few days surrounded by nature with no emails, no deadlines, just the wild and my camera. I needed this. Chris, my oldest friend, needed it too, though he wasn't much of a camper. I convinced him to come along, figuring the trip might rekindle our bond. We parked my RV at a quiet trailhead miles from the crowded campgrounds. As I unloaded my gear, Chris sat on a rock, fiddling with a bottle of water. "I still don't know why I agreed to this," he muttered, squinting at the dense forest. "It's like the trees are closing in." I laughed. "That's the point, Chris. We're off the grid. Fresh air, peace, maybe even some wildlife for me to photograph." "Yeah, great. Bears, wolves, that sounds peaceful." I ignored him, shouldering my pack. "Come on, it's a short hike. We'll camp near the river." Chris groaned but followed. The trail was narrow, lined with jagged cliffs and thick underbrush. The gorge lived up to its reputation, stunning, rugged, and untamed. But there was something else too. The air felt heavy. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the humidity. By the time we reached the riverbed, the sun was low on the horizon. I paused, staring. Something was wrong. The river was gone. Where there should have been rushing water, there was only cracked, dry earth. Chris stopped beside me, his expression shifting from annoyance to unease. Evan, are you sure this is the spot?" "Positive," I said, pulling out my map. "The river runs right through here." Chris crouched, touching the dry ground. "Looks like it hasn't been here in years." "That's impossible. It was flowing last week." My voice faltered. It didn't make sense. I felt a flicker of doubt, but quickly buried it. "It's probably seasonal," I lied, unwilling to admit how unsettling this was. "Let's set up camp." As night fell, the forest came alive, or rather, it didn't. Normally, the woods buzzed with life, insects, frogs, rustling leaves, but here the silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. Chris sat close to the fire, nervously poking at the flames. "Does it feel quiet to you?" "It's remote," I said, fiddling with my camera. "Relax," he snorted. "Sure. Relax while nature murders me." "Chris, you're being—" I stopped. My camera had just powered down. Frowning, I turned it back on and reviewed the footage from earlier. That's when I saw it. A figure. It was blurry, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably humanoid. It stood at the edge of the frame, hidden among the trees. I blinked, rewound the clip, and zoomed in. The image distorted, the figure disappearing into static. "What's wrong?" Chris asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing," I said quickly, shutting the camera off. "Just a glitch." The first night passed without sleep. I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps circling our campsite, stopping just outside the firelight. Every time I shone my flashlight, there was nothing. Nothing. Chris didn't hear it. He was snoring in his tent, blissfully unaware. The next morning, we met Laura. She appeared suddenly, stepping out from the trees as we packed our gear. Her boots were worn, her hair tied back beneath a bandana. She looked like she belonged here, unlike Chris, who flinched at the sight of her. "Morning," she said, her tone friendly but guarded. "Didn't expect to see anyone this far out." "We're camping," I said, forcing a smile, "doing some photography." She nodded, her dark eyes scanning the dry riverbed. "Strange, isn't it? This river used to run year-round." "You've been here before?" Chris asked. "A few times," she said, "but I stay on the main trails now. This area is different." "Different how?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated. "You've heard the stories, right? About the Wendigo?" Chris groaned. "Oh, great, a ghost story. That's what I need." "It's not a ghost," Laura said sharply. "It's a spirit, a creature. The Wendigo appears when something's wrong, when the land's been disrespected or people have gone too far. It preys on greed and hunger." I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Well, good thing we're not greedy." Laura didn't laugh. She looked at me, then at Chris. "Be careful. Things can change quickly out here." Her warning lingered as we hiked deeper into the forest. Chris was unusually quiet, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. I tried to shake off my unease, focusing on setting up new motion sensor cameras. But as I reviewed the footage, the images disturbed me. The cameras had captured blurry shapes, elongated, humanoid figures skirting the edges of the frame. I didn't tell Chris, he was already on edge. That night, the forest came alive with sounds, faint growls, snapping twigs, and something that sounded like breathing. I stayed by the fire, gripping my flashlight while Chris sat rigid beside me. "I heard it," he whispered. "Tell me you heard it." "I heard it," I admitted. "Stay close." At some point, Chris stood abruptly. "I'm going to the RV." "No way," I said. "It's too far," but he was already walking into the darkness. I chased after him, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. "Chris, stop!" He turned, his face pale. "Didn't you hear her? Laura's voice. She's calling for help." I stared at him. "Chris, Laura's not here." But he wasn't listening. He kept moving faster now until I grabbed his arm and yanked him back. "Listen to me!" I shouted. "You're not thinking clearly." Chris looked at me confused, as if waking from a dream. I thought I heard." The growling returned, closer this time. The foul stench of decay filled the air, making my stomach churn. Something moved in the shadows, too fast to see. "Run," I whispered. We sprinted back to camp, but the fire had died. The woods pressed in around us, suffocating and silent. Then came the mimicry. "Chris," a voice called identical to mine. He froze, staring into the trees. "Evan? What?" "It's not me," I hissed. "Don't listen to it." The voice came again, closer. "Chris, help me." Chris grabbed my arm, his face white with fear. "What is that?" The answer came with the snap of branches. A figure stepped into the clearing. A gaunt, elongated humanoid with glowing eyes and claws that gleamed in the faint moonlight. The smell of rot was overwhelming. It was the Wendigo. I shoved Chris toward the trail. "Run! Don't stop!" The Wendigo moved with unnatural speed, circling us. Its glowing eyes locked on Chris. It growled, a guttural, bone-chilling sound. Chris tripped, falling hard, and I turned back, swinging my flashlight wildly. The light caught the creature's face, twisted and skeletal, its lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. It flinched, momentarily blinded, and I used the distraction to drag Chris to his feet. We stumbled through the forest, the Wendigo's footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to keep moving. We found Laura at the edge of the forest. She had a torch in one hand and a look of grim determination on her face. "It's here, isn't it?" she said. I nodded, gasping for breath. What do we do? Fire, she said. It's the only thing that weakens it. Chris was shaking, his face pale. We're going to die out here. No, we're not, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We fight. Laura handed me a torch, lighting it with hers. The Wendigo emerged moments later, its movements jerky and unnatural. It circled us, growling, its eyes gleaming with hunger. Hold your ground, Laura said. Don't let it separate us. The creature lunged. Faster than I could react, Laura swung her torch. The flames grazed its side and it screeched, recoiling. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard. Chris panicked, dropping his torch and bolting into the woods. Chris, no! I shouted, but it was too late. The Wendigo turned, chasing after him. Stay here, I told Laura, running after my friend. I found Chris slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow. The Wendigo stood over him, its claws poised. I didn't think. I just acted, swinging my torch with all my strength. The flames caught its arm and it howled, retreating into the shadows. Chris looked up at me, his eyes glassy. Evan, he whispered. It's inside my head. I can't stop it. You're fine, I said, pulling him to his feet. We're getting out of here. We made it back to Laura, but Chris wasn't the same. He muttered incoherently, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things I couldn't. We have to go, Laura said. Now. The three of us ran, the Wendigo's growls following us all the way to the RV. When we finally reached it, I shoved Chris inside and slammed the door. Laura and I collapsed, exhausted, but something felt wrong. Chris was silent, sitting in the corner, his head bowed. I approached cautiously. Chris, I said. He looked up, smiling, a cold, unnatural smile. You can't escape, he said, his voice distorted. The Wendigo's reflection gleamed in his eyes. We drove away, leaving the gorge behind, but the claw marks on the RV side were a stark reminder of what we'd faced. Chris didn't speak again. His smile was frozen, his eyes distant. As we crossed the state line, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the forest, watching us. We survived, but I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. My name is Amanda Hughes, and I'm 35 years old. This happened last summer during what I thought would be just another adventure to fuel my travel blog. I've spent the better part of my career exploring hidden gems and offbeat places, but nothing, not even the ghost tours in Savannah or the creepy hotels in New Orleans, could have prepared me for Enchanted Rock. I pulled my RV into the campsite just before noon. Enchanted Rock rose in the distance, a massive pink granite dome that glowed faintly under the Texas sun. I'd been here once as a kid, but I couldn't remember much beyond the climb and my mom yelling at me to stay close. This time I was alone, and I planned to capture every bit of its beauty. After parking in a secluded spot, I grabbed my camera and gear, excited to scout the area. The plan was simple. Hike to the summit, take some photos, and interview a few locals about the legends. The place had plenty of them, and ancient curses, ghostly sightings, and strange disappearances. Perfect fodder for a post that would rake in clicks. I checked in at the visitor center where I met Maggie, a park ranger who looked to be in her late 50s. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and had a weathered face that reminded me of an old cowboy movie. First time here? She asked, her tone friendly but measured. First time as an adult, I said, smiling. I'm a travel writer, and I wanted to cover some of the stories about the rock, the spooky stuff. Her expression shifted slightly. It's a beautiful place, but you need to respect it, especially after dark. Why? Is it really haunted? I teased. She hesitated before answering. There are things here older than you can imagine. The Tonkawa people believe this was a sacred site. They say a warrior cursed it before he died. Instead, I've seen enough strange things to believe there's truth to it. I laughed nervously. Well, I'm not planning to anger any spirits. Her gaze lingered on me, her eyes serious. Just don't wander too far off. And if you hear drumming, go the other way. I dismissed her warning as local folklore meant to entertain tourists, but as I hiked up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rock was watching me. The path twisted through clusters of boulders and dry scrub, just the air hot and still. Occasionally I'd hear a bird or the rustle of a lizard darting through the brush, but otherwise it was unnervingly quiet. About halfway up, I noticed something strange, symbols etched into the granite. They were rough and jagged, like they'd been scratched in haste, and they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I snapped a few photos, thinking they'd make for a good mystery in my blog. Then, for no reason I could explain, a chill ran down my spine. It was the middle of the day, blazing hot, but the air felt cold and heavy. I brushed it off as nerves and kept climbing. When I reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The horizon stretched endlessly, the land below dotted with patches of green and the occasional shimmer of water. I set up my tripod and began taking pictures, losing myself in the work. That's when I heard it. A faint drumming sound carried on the wind. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady rhythm, but it seemed to come from all around me. "Maggie was just trying to spook you," I muttered, shaking my head. But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, more insistent. I packed up quickly and started back down the trail, my nerves on edge. The shadows seemed darker now, the shapes of the rocks more menacing. I told myself I was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for the sound. Maybe someone was drumming at the base of the rock. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I stayed in my RV, editing the photos I'd taken. They were stunning, capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape perfectly. But when I scrolled through the shots of the summit, I stopped cold. In one of the pictures taken at the edge of the overlook, there was a figure. It was faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there. A tall, shadowy shape that hadn't been there when I snapped the shot. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Was it a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera? I tried to rationalize it, but the memory of that drumming filled my mind, and suddenly I didn't feel so alone. The first knock came around midnight, soft, tentative, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. My blood turned to ice. I froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. Grabbing a flashlight, I moved to the window and peered outside. The campsite was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the trees. Then I saw it, etched into the side of the RV, that same symbol I'd seen on the rock earlier that day. My hands trembled as I stepped back, my mind racing. Someone was messing with me. They had to be. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a prank. The next morning, I drove to town and asked around about the symbols. Most people didn't recognize them, but an older man at a coffee shop told me they looked like warnings used by the Tonkawa. They marked sacred places, he said, places where the spirits were restless. The word restless stuck with me. On a whim, I stopped by the visitor center and found Maggie. When I told her what had happened, she frowned deeply. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "The rock isn't just a place, it's alive, and you've drawn its attention." "Attention?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. "You've disturbed something that doesn't want to be disturbed." I didn't leave. I should have, but my curiosity and my pride kept me there. That night, the drumming returned, louder and closer than before. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with an invisible weight. I tried to sleep, but kept waking to strange noises, footsteps circling the RV, faint whispers just outside the door. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, determined to confront whatever or whoever was tormenting me. The campsite was shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, jagged shadows as I shone the light around. At the edge of the clearing, I spotted something, an altar of stones arranged in a circle. In the center lay a bundle of feathers and bones, tied with twine. My breath caught. The drumming grew louder, echoing in my ears. And then I saw him, the shadowy figure from my photo. He stood just beyond the altar, his form shifting and flickering like smoke. "You're not real," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." But then he moved, stepping closer. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and the air grew colder with each step. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and the flashlight rolled out of my hand. "Leave," a voice hissed, deep and guttural, reverberating through the clearing. Scrambling to my feet, I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. The drumming stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing on the summit, watching me. I've written about many places since then, but I'll never return to Enchanted Rock. Some things are meant to remain untouched, their stories told in whispers and warnings. And if you ever visit, take Maggie's advice. If you hear drumming, go the other way. My name's Alexander Simmons. It was 2008, and I was on my third night of RV camping just outside the Sierra Nevada mountains, not too far from Mono Lake. Now, I wouldn't call myself an outdoorsman by any stretch of the imagination. Honestly, I was more of a stay inside, sip on something warm kind of guy. But a divorce and a midlife crisis will drive you to some weird places. After a decade of city noise, I figured a solo RV trip into the mountains might clear my head. Turns out, that kind of peace and quiet isn't always as comforting as you'd think. I'd parked my RV at one of those smaller, secluded campsites where you're more likely to find deer than people, which was kind of the point. The first couple of nights were uneventful. Just me, a few beers, and some bad attempts at cooking over a campfire. I'd been telling myself it was the perfect kind of escape, though I'll admit that by night 3, the isolation had started to feel a little less peaceful and more claustrophobic. But what was I going to do? Pack up and head back to the city? Nah, that would have felt like losing. Plus, I was still trying to get used to sleeping in an RV without the constant hum of city life around me. Everything out there was too still. Every tiny crack in the forest made my skin crawl. But hey, what's a little discomfort compared to proving to myself I wasn't totally losing my edge at 41? That night, as I was lying on the RV bed scrolling through some half-downloaded articles on my phone, I noticed the light outside flicker. Not a campfire glow, something sharper, more precise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, maybe a reflection of something metallic in the distance. But it happened again, this time closer. I sat up, listening. I wasn't one of those paranoid types, but when you're out alone in the mountains, your mind has a way of turning normal things into, well, not so normal things. For a while, nothing happened. The wind rustled the leaves, an owl hooted off in the distance, the kind of noises you should expect in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as I was about to let it go and settle back into my semi-uncomfortable RV bed, there was a sound. Not the wind, not some critter scurrying about. This was the distinct crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the trees just beyond my RV. I slid out of bed and peered out the tiny RV window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the pitch-black woods and the faint silhouette of my truck parked beside the RV. But then there it was, a figure standing still, halfway between the trees and my vehicle. At first, I figured it was just another camper who'd wandered over to the wrong site, but then I realized there wasn't supposed to be anyone else this far out. I hadn't even heard the sound of another RV or car coming in earlier. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The figure stood there frozen, almost like it was waiting for something. They were tall and lanky, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, but something felt off. My gut was telling me this wasn't just some lost hiker, and out here, you don't ignore gut feelings. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating before I opened the RV door. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't own a gun, never really saw the need in the city, and honestly, I'd thought the RV would provide enough protection from whatever the woods had to offer. You know, deer, maybe a curious bear or something, not a strange man lurking outside. The moment I stepped outside, the figure bolted, fast. I shined my flashlight in the direction they ran, catching a glimpse of a dirty face, long, stringy hair, and something like a wild grin flashing in the dark. But before I could process it, they were gone, disappearing into the thick trees. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that maybe it was just some vagrant who didn't want trouble. But when I got back inside, Something had changed. The flashlight beam caught a reflection on the passenger seat of my RV. My heart sank when I saw it. A large hunting knife jammed into the seat. It wasn't mine. Now I know what you're thinking. How could I have missed someone sneaking into my RV? I couldn't tell you. Maybe I had dozed off earlier, or maybe this guy was just good at what he did. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't alone, and whoever this guy was, he had keys. I fumbled for my phone, planning to call the Rangers, but of course, out here, there was no signal. So, like any rational person, I locked every door and window, grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I had, a camping hatchet, and sat in the driver's seat, keeping an eye on the tree line. I wasn't planning on staying the night anymore. At first light, I was getting the hell out of there. But first light didn't come fast enough. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my adrenaline, because the next thing I knew, it was around 2 a.m., and the entire RV shook. It wasn't a tree falling or some kind of animal bumping into it. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to force their way in. I jumped up, clutching the hatchet, and shouted out, hoping to scare them off, but the pounding didn't stop. When the door finally flew open, it wasn't subtle. The figure from earlier barreled in wildly, grinning and holding a crowbar. There was no conversation, no demands. He lunged at me immediately, swinging the crowbar and catching me off guard. I swung back with the hatchet, but missed. He was faster than I expected. I won't bore you with the gory details, but let's just say it wasn't one of those quick, clean self-defense moments you see in the movies. I got some good hits in, but not before he bashed me pretty good with the crowbar. Blood was everywhere, his, mine. It all blended together in the chaos. At some point, we both fell out of the RV and the fight spilled onto the ground. I don't know how, but I got the upper hand, slamming the hatchet down into his chest. The fight stopped then, just like that. I remember standing over him, gasping for air, not really registering what had happened until I saw the light dimming in his wild eyes. He was gone. I staggered back into the RV, dazed, bloody, and in shock. I locked myself inside, not knowing what else to do. Calling for help wasn't an option out here, so I waited. Just me, the dead guy outside, and the silence of the forest. By the time morning rolled around, I was still wide awake, eyes fixed on the body outside. I don't know why I hadn't moved it. Maybe I just needed the daylight to confirm it wasn't some sick nightmare. Eventually, I stepped out, the crisp mountain air biting at my face. I searched the man's pockets, half expecting to find nothing. But there it was, his wallet. His name was Warren Gibson. He was wanted in 3 states for murder, and here I was, alone with his body, no cell service, and a whole mess of questions I didn't have the answers to. The cops eventually found me that afternoon after a couple of hikers came across my bloodied RV and freaked out. They took one look at me, the body, and started asking the usual questions. I don't even remember half of what I told them, just that it was self-defense, which, to be fair, was the truth. Turns out Warren had been squatting in the mountains for years, preying on isolated campers. They'd been looking for him for a long time. Funny thing is, I'd planned this trip to escape the chaos of the city, to find some peace and quiet. I ended up right in the middle of someone else's nightmare. Still, all things considered, I guess I got off easy. My name is Gary Ellis, and I'm 31 years old. This happened last December when I took my RV to Red Lake Peatland in Minnesota for a solo trip. I'm a freelance travel writer and photographer, and I was chasing a story about one of the most untouched, eerie landscapes in the country. I thought it would be just another job, a chance to snap some photos, write a poetic description of misty bogs, and call it a day. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived at the edge of the bog in the late afternoon. The narrow dirt road leading to the campsite was rougher than I expected, and the RV's tires sank slightly into the damp, muddy ground. The air felt heavy, laden with the smell of decaying vegetation and stagnant water. I parked where the road widened into a makeshift lot, unable to get closer to the marked trails. My plan was to hike in with my camera gear and come back to the RV to write notes at night. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no wind, just an oppressive stillness, broken only by the occasional squelch of my boots in the mud. I dismissed the unease gnawing at me and focused on setting up my camera. The light filtering through the mist was perfect, soft and golden, illuminating the strange, otherworldly beauty of the bog. I ventured deeper, snapping shots of twisted trees, moss-covered hummocks, and pools of water that mirrored the pale sky. That's when I saw it. Hanging from a branch ahead was a small doll, crudely made of sticks and wrapped in dirty fabric. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. I stopped and stared at it, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It looked like some kind of voodoo charm, but this wasn't Louisiana. It was Minnesota. "Just local kids messing around," I muttered, though the words didn't make me feel any better. I took a photo of it for context and kept walking. The mist thickened as the sun sank lower. I'd planned to head back before dark, but the trails seemed to twist and shift, leading me in circles. My GPS showed me moving in the right direction, yet I kept passing the same tree with the hanging doll. The logical part of my brain told me I was tired and misreading the landmarks, but a deeper, instinctual part of me felt watched. The first whisper came as I stopped to check my map. Grayson. My name, faint and drawn out, drifted through the mist. I froze, my breath catching. "Hello?" I called, turning in a slow circle. My flashlight beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but trees and water. Grayson. It came again from a different direction, closer this time. My pulse quickened. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I packed up my gear in record time and retraced my steps as best I could, refusing to look back at the whispering voice. By the time I reached the RV, the mist had swallowed the entire area. I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtains shut, and turned on every light I had. I told myself it was just my imagination, a mix of fatigue and isolation playing tricks on me. But when I reviewed the photos I'd taken, my stomach sank. Half the images were distorted, warped by static-like streaks that hadn't been visible in my viewfinder. In one shot, the photo of the doll, there was something else behind it. Half shrouded in the mist stood a figure. A woman, her face obscured by a tangle of dark hair, her body draped in rags. She was turned toward the camera, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I shut my laptop and poured myself a stiff drink, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a quirk of the lens. But the image was burned into my mind. The next morning, I decided to venture into town. The air outside was heavy and damp, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I pulled out of the lot, an elderly woman flagged me down from the side of the road. She wore a long coat and a knit hat, her face lined with age, but her eyes were sharp. I rolled down my window and she leaned in, her gaze piercing. "You've been to the bog," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied uneasily. "I'm working on a story." She frowned, shaking her head. "You shouldn't be out there. That place isn't safe. It's cursed." I stiffened. "Cursed? You mean the doll I found?" Her eyes widened. "You touched it?" "No, I just photographed it." The woman crossed herself and muttered something under her breath. "The witch doesn't like to be disturbed," she said. "She'll make sure you don't leave." Before I could ask what she meant, she walked away, vanishing into the mist. By the time I returned to the bog that afternoon, the air was colder, the silence even more oppressive. My GPS had worked fine in town, but became unreliable again as soon as I parked. I decided to stick close to the trail this time, but that didn't stop the whispers. Grayson. They came from every direction, each one more insistent than the last. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my work. But then I saw her. The figure from the photograph stood in the distance, her silhouette barely visible through the mist. She didn't move but seemed to watch me, her presence pulling at something deep and primal in my chest. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the water. Against my better judgment, I followed her gesture, stepping closer to the edge of the bog. The water was dark, reflecting nothing, and as I stared, shapes began to form beneath the surface, faces distorted and anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The final straw came that evening. I was packing up my gear when a young man stumbled out of the mist, his face pale and panicked. "Are you Grayson?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," I said wearily. "Who are you?" "Zach, I'm an intern at the park. I came to check on you after Ruby. The old lady in town said you might be in trouble." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more unnerved. Zach was friendly enough, but he seemed spooked, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "We shouldn't stay here," he said. "The stories, they're true. People disappear in this bog. You need to leave." I nodded, grateful for the company, and we started back toward the RV. But the mist thickened, swallowing the trail entirely. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. Zach froze. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. The woman stepped out of the mist, her hollow eyes locking onto Zach. He screamed as she lunged toward him, her form twisting and stretching unnaturally. "Run!" Zach shouted, and I didn't hesitate. I sprinted through the mist, my heart hammering. The whispers were deafening now, accusing me, pleading with me. "Why did you leave me, Grayson?" One voice cried, eerily familiar. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping for breath. The RV was right where I'd left it, and I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside. As I started the engine, I glanced back toward the trail. A woman stood at the edge of the lot, her rags billowing in an unseen wind. She didn't move, but I could feel her hatred, her hunger, as if she were willing me to step out. I slammed the door shut and sped away, the mist chasing me until I hit the main road. I never went back to Red Lake Petland, but the bog never left me. The photos I took that week are distorted beyond recognition, except for one. It's a clear shot of the woman standing in the water, her eyes fixed on the camera. Sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice. It's faint, but it's always there, whispering my name. And I know deep down that the bog is still waiting for me to return. I'd been driving for hours, the narrow desert highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was a golden orb sinking behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery hues. My RV rattled as the pavement turned to dirt, the road leading me deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Canyon Hollow. This was where I wanted to be. Alone, surrounded by nothing but red rock and the occasional shriek of a hawk. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace, or at least distraction. 6 months had passed since the accident, but the guilt was as raw as ever. I should have been more careful. I couldn't escape that thought, no matter how far I drove. Canyon Hollow was famous for its petroglyphs, remnants of an ancient people whose art told stories of life, death, and something in between. It was also infamous for its mysteries, tales of settlers who vanished, of travelers who never made it out. But I didn't believe in that sort of thing. History was history, nothing more. I pulled into the campground as dusk settled, parked near the edge of the canyon. There were only 2 other campers, an older couple in a beat-up RV several spots down. They waved as I stepped out, and I gave them a nod. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears. I shook it off and set up camp, promising myself a good night's rest before exploring the next day. That first night, I dreamed of the accident. I was back on the ridge, the rocks crumbling beneath my feet. I heard Alex shouting, his voice raw with panic. My hands reached out for him, but I wasn't fast enough. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the RV as it settled into the cool desert air. I stepped outside for some fresh air. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the red rocks. I could see the older couple's RV, their lights off. Beyond them, the canyon stretched out, an ocean of darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. "Ethan." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Alex's. Impossible, I told myself, just a trick of the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void before retreating to the safety of the RV. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was bright, and the desert looked almost friendly in the daylight. I packed a bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the petroglyphs. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow canyons and open plains dotted with junipers. The carvings appeared in clusters, etched into the stone with astonishing precision. Animals, spirals, figures locked in what looked like dances or battles. Then I found the symbols. Unlike the other carvings, these were jagged and erratic, spirals that twisted into themselves like whirlpools. They didn't fit with the rest of the art. Standing there, I felt a chill despite the sun. It wasn't just the symbols, it was the silence. No birds, no wind, just me and the rocks. When I got back to camp, the older couple's RV was gone. At first, I thought that they'd left while I was out, but their spot was wrong. Their folding chairs were still there, along with a cooler and a half-empty coffee mug. Their fire pit had ashes that were still warm. I walked over, calling out, but no one answered. The RV keys were sitting on the folding table as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. A heavy unease settled over me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd gone for a hike, maybe they'd gotten a ride into town, but as night fell, the unease turned into something closer to fear. The wind picked up after sundown, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I sat inside the RV, trying to focus on anything but the emptiness outside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on my passenger seat, leather-bound and worn. I hadn't seen it there before. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries chronicling the travels of someone who had camped here before me. At first, the notes were mundane, descriptions of the canyon, complaints about the heat. But as the entries went on, they grew darker. Something is out there. I see shadows at night. Faces in the mirrors. I thought I was alone, but I'm not. They're watching me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, don't let them in. I snapped the journal shut, my hands trembling. The RV groaned as the wind buffeted it, and for a moment I thought I heard a knock at the door. Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, louder. Hello? I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt leading from the ridge down to my RV. My stomach turned. That night, I barricaded the door with everything I could find. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers started around midnight, faint at first, then louder. They called my name, voices I recognized but couldn't place. Alex was one of them. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up as fast as I could and started the engine, at relief flooding me when it roared to life. But as I drove toward the exit, the road twisted and looped, always bringing me back to the campground. I tried every direction, but it was no use. It was like the canyon wouldn't let me go. Desperation drove me back to the petroglyphs. I followed the spirals, hoping they held some kind of answer. The silence was crushing now, the air heavy with dread. And then I saw it, a wagon train, fully intact, crossing the canyon in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, but as I got closer, the figures became clearer. Men, women, and children in 19th century clothing. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. I shouted, waving my arms, but they didn't react. As I approached, they vanished, leaving only skeletal remains of wagons and rusted tools in their wake. That night, they came for me. I sat in the RV, knife in hand, as shadows moved outside. The voices were louder now, pleading and accusing all at once. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" Alex's voice cut through the din, filled with anger and sorrow. The windows fogged as hollow faces pressed against the glass, their empty eye sockets weeping black tears. They began to bang on the walls, the door shaking on its hinges. "You can't hide," they whispered. "You belong here with us." I thought of the journal, of its warning not to let them in. But the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with guilt and regret. I clutched the knife, my knuckles white. Then I remembered the spirals. The petroglyphs had to mean something, a way out, a key. I grabbed Alex's compass, the only keepsake I had of him, and bolted from the RV. The shadows followed, their whispers echoing through the canyon. I reached the spirals and fell to my knees, holding the compass above the carvings. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Alex." The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. One by one, they dissolved into the canyon mist, their voices fading into silence. The compass grew warm in my hand before falling still. The road was clear. The next morning, I didn't question it. I drove until the canyon was a distant memory, the horizon opening up before me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching, that someday, somewhere, the whispers will start again. My name is Amanda Hughes, and I'm 36 years old. This happened in July when my wife Lila, our 14-year-old daughter Kara, and my younger brother Matt decided to camp in Paul Bunyan State Forest, Minnesota. What started as a peaceful family getaway turned into a nightmare, one I still wake from in a cold sweat, hearing Kara's voice calling from the woods. It was my idea to camp there. I'd read about its rugged trails and unspoiled beauty, a perfect escape from our busy lives. Lila agreed, eager to sketch the landscape, and Kara couldn't wait to explore. Matt was a wild card, an adrenaline junkie who loved mocking my love for careful planning. I should have known better. I'd heard stories about Devil's Hollow, an area deep within the forest with an evil reputation, but I dismissed them as local legend. I shouldn't have. We arrived mid-morning on a Friday. The air was crisp, the trees tall and majestic, and the drive-in had been uneventful. The dirt road leading to our campsite wound through dense woods, the kind that seemed to whisper when the wind blew. Our spot was secluded, with just enough space for our RV and Matt's pop-up tent. After setting up, Kara immediately took off to explore, her curiosity as boundless as her energy. "Kara!" I called after her. "Stay where we can see you." She waved me off. "I'm just looking at the trees, Dad." Lila gave me a look, part amused, part exasperated. "Let her be, Julian. She's 12, not 2. Matt chuckled. "Relax, big bro. What's the worst that could happen?" That night, the worst began. It started with a storm. Matt's cheap tent leaked like a sieve, so he ended up in the RV with us. He grumbled, blaming me for his misery because I'd picked the middle of nowhere for our trip. Lila ignored him, sketching by flashlight, and Kara lay curled up on the RV's bench seat, fast asleep. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Kara heading to the bathroom, but when I checked, she was still sleeping. The footsteps were outside, circling the RV, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding rain. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Lila. She nodded, her eyes wide. "It's probably an animal," she said, though her voice wavered. Matt, oblivious, snored loudly from the bunk above. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the RV door, peering into the night. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the campsite. Nothing. No movement, no sound but the rain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. The next day, Kara found the dolls. She'd wandered off again while we prepared breakfast, her curiosity always getting the better of her. When she returned, she held a small wooden figure in her hand. It was crudely carved from some kind of dark wood, with exaggerated feet, eyes wide with fear, and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. "Look what I found," she said, grinning. Lila frowned. "Where did you get that?" "By the trail. There were a bunch of them, half buried in the dirt." "Can I keep it?" "No," I said too sharply. "Put it back where you found it." Kara's face fell. "It's just a doll." Lila placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's right, sweetheart. It's not ours to take." Grumbling, Kara trudged back to the trail. When she returned, she seemed distant, distracted. I told myself she was just sulking, but later, when I saw her drawing the doll in her notebook, I wondered if it had left more of an impression than she'd let on. The forest grew stranger the longer we stayed. Matt's GPS stopped working, and my phone's compass spun uselessly. Lila's watch froze at 3:17 p.m. Trails we'd followed easily on our first day seemed unfamiliar, their landmarks shifting. Kara started talking about an imaginary friend she'd met in the woods. "He's tall and funny," she said at dinner. "He knows all about the forest." Lila exchanged a glance with me. "What's his name?" she asked. "He didn't say," Kara replied, poking at her food. "But he showed me a secret place. Can I go there tomorrow?" "No," I said firmly. "You're staying with us from now on." Kara rolled her eyes, but didn't argue. That night, I woke to the sound of laughter. It was faint, drifting through the trees, high-pitched and childlike. For a moment, I thought it was Kara, but when I checked, she was fast asleep. The laughter continued, distant yet unmistakable. By the third day, I was ready to leave. The forest felt alive, its shadows darker, its silence heavier. Matt laughed off my concerns, calling me paranoid. "It's just the woods, Derek. You're letting your imagination run wild." But even he couldn't explain the claw marks we found on the RV that morning, long and deep, gouged into the metal. "Kara, did you see any animals around last night?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, but my friend says we shouldn't be here." "Your friend?" Lila asked sharply. "What did he say?" Kara hesitated. "He says this place isn't for us. He wants me to stay, though. He said I could play forever." My blood ran cold. "Kara, stop talking to this friend. He's not real." Her lip quivered. "He is real, and he's mad at you." That evening, Kara disappeared. We'd been packing up to leave when she wandered off again. I called her name until my throat was raw, my panic growing with each unanswered shout. Lila was hysterical, Matt uncharacteristically silent. We searched for hours, deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone. We found her at sunset, standing in the clearing, holding another wooden doll. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy. Lila ran to her, pulling her into a hug, but Kara didn't respond. She just stared ahead, unblinking. "She's fine," Matt said. "She probably just—" "Shut up, Matt," I snapped. "We need to get out of here. Now." That night, the spirit came for us. Kara was tucked into the RV, her eyes still vacant. Lila and I stood watch, knives clutched in trembling hands. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, circling the RV, joined by laughter and whispers. "Julian." The voice was soft, familiar. It was Kara's voice, but Kara was inside the RV. The door rattled as if someone was trying to open it. Lila clutched my arm. "Don't let it in," she whispered. The rattling stopped, and the shadow appeared, a figure tall and thin, its limbs wrong, its face smooth and pale. It stared at us through the window, its head tilting unnaturally. "Go away," I shouted, brandishing the knife. The shadow didn't move. Then it spoke. "Stay with us, Kara. Play forever." My blood turned to ice. "You can't have her." The shadow melted into the darkness, but the laughter remained, growing louder, closer. I knew then we couldn't stay. The forest wanted Kara. It wouldn't stop until it had her. We fled to Devil's Hollow, the place Kara's friend had shown her. It was the only way to end this. The clearing was filled with wooden dolls, hundreds of them, each carved with a child's terrified face. Lila knelt, arranging a circle of salt and herbs, while I held Kara close. "Let them go," Lila shouted into the night. "Release them." The air grew icy, the laughter turning to screams. The shadow reappeared, larger now, its form twisting and shifting. It reached for Kara, but Lila stood her ground, chanting words I didn't understand. The shadow faltered, its edges blurring. Matt, ignoring my protests, grabbed one of the dolls and set it on fire. The flames roared to life, spreading to the others. The shadow let out an unearthly wail, its form collapsing into itself. The screams faded, the forest falling silent. Kara blinked, her expression clearing. "Dad," she whispered. "It's okay," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You're safe now." We left that night vowing never to return, but the hollow stayed with us. Kara refuses to talk about her friend, though I've caught her drawing him, a tall, shadowy figure lurking in the background. Lila says we did the right thing, but I'm not so sure. The forest took something from us, something intangible but vital. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter again. Nobody tells you that being a small-town cop is just glorified babysitting. Not until you're knee-deep in chasing down some idiot for stealing lawn chairs off his neighbor's porch. My name's Gary Ellis. I've been patrolling the streets of Silver Grove, Ohio for the better part of 11 years. Not a long time, but long enough to get a feel for the place, know everyone by their first name, and learn which drunk idiots you're going to have to drag out of the bar after a Browns game. It was 1995, a year that stuck with me for a lot of reasons, mostly because it was the year everything went sideways, way sideways. Small towns have their secrets, sure, but nothing like this. So it all started when the calls came in about a group of kids gone missing. Typical small town stuff. You'd think kids wandering off into the woods to do whatever it is kids do these days. Hell, I remember sneaking into the woods as a kid myself. But this was different. It wasn't just a couple of teenagers disappearing after a Saturday night. We were talking 4 kids, all under the age of 12. They were out for a camping trip with some Boy Scout group, and nobody had seen them since they wandered away from the campfire. Naturally, I got called in along with my partner, Jared Granger. Granger, bless his soul, was as reliable as a broken flashlight, but he had a good heart, even if it was buried under layers of bad jokes and self-doubt. We headed out to where the kids were last seen, right at the edge of Fox Hollow Woods, a stretch of thick forest that everyone in town avoided, mostly because of the rumors. You've heard of the creepy stories, right? Every town has them. Fox Hollow had its share. The old-timers used to talk about strange animals, twisted things that shouldn't exist, lurking deep in the woods. Kids would swear they saw shadows moving just outside their vision. Me? I figured it was just the usual nonsense. You hear something enough times and it loses its edge. We spent the better part of the morning trudging through the woods, calling out the kids' names, hoping they'd come running. Nothing. No sign of them. Not even a footprint or a half-eaten sandwich. And then Granger, in his infinite wisdom, decided to crack a joke. Maybe they got snatched by Bigfoot, Spivey, he said, chuckling to himself. I ignored him. Granger had a habit of cracking jokes when things got tense, but even he started to get quiet when we found the first clue, at least what we thought was a clue. About a mile in, we stumbled across an old beat-up tent. Looked like it had been there for years. Inside, we found a pile of old bones, picked clean. Not human, thank God, but something about it gave me the creeps. I radioed back to the station, told them we'd found a campsite, but no sign of the kids. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, telling us to keep searching, so we did. We went deeper into Fox Hollow than I ever had before. Granger was quiet by now, his usual jokes replaced with nervous glances over his shoulder. It was late afternoon when we found something I still can't explain. There was this clearing, completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. In the center of the clearing was a small mound, like someone had piled up dirt and left it there. It wasn't the mound that bothered me, though. It was what was on top of it. A pile of shoes, tiny shoes, like the kind you'd see on kids. Some of them were old, dirty, covered in mud, while others looked practically new, like they'd just been worn yesterday. My stomach turned, and Granger looked like he was about to be sick. Maybe it's some kind of prank, Granger muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We were standing there, trying to figure out what to do next, when we heard something. A rustling sound, like leaves being dragged across the ground. We both turned at the same time, and that's when we saw it, or him, I guess. At first, I thought it was a man, just some vagrant who'd been living in the woods too long. He was hunched over, his back bent in a way that didn't seem natural. His arms were too long, his skin stretched thin, and his head, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked like he was wearing a mask, but it wasn't a mask. His face was twisted, contorted, like it had been melted and reshaped into something almost human, but not quite. He didn't move right either. It was like he was learning how to walk all over again. Jerky movements, his head twitching from side to side as he shuffled toward us. My hand went straight to my holster, but Granger was frozen. Couldn't blame him. I was terrified too. But cops don't get paid to be scared, so I yelled out, "Stop, police!" The thing didn't stop. It just kept coming. Slow at first, but then it broke into a run, barreling toward us faster than anything that should be able to move on 2 legs. I pulled my gun, fired twice, dead center. It should have dropped, but it didn't. Just kept coming. Granger finally snapped out of it, pulled his gun too, and we both unloaded on this thing, but it was like shooting at air. It didn't even flinch. I wish I could say we stood our ground, acted like the tough cops we were supposed to be, but I'd be lying. We ran. We ran like hell, crashing through the trees, barely able to keep our footing. That thing, it chased us. But it wasn't just following us. It was toying with us, cutting us off, herding us in one direction, deeper into the woods. We finally made it to a stream, and I dove into it, figuring that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't follow us into the water. Granger was right behind me, gasping for air. I'll never forget the look on his face, the terror that had replaced his usual cocky grin. "Did you see it?" Granger whispered, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. We stayed there in the water for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. It was getting dark by the time we finally crawled out and made our way back to the road. By then, I was starting to think we'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe it was just some kind of mass hysteria. But then we found Granger's jacket. It was lying on the road, torn to shreds. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just his jacket, lying there like a forgotten piece of litter. We reported it, of course, told the chief what we'd seen, but you can imagine how that went. Nobody believed us. Missing kids, sure, but a monster in the woods? Yeah, right. We were told to take a few days off, clear our heads, but I couldn't clear my head. Neither could Granger. He stopped coming to work after that, said he was moving, getting the hell out of Silver Grove. Can't say I blame him. I stuck around, though. Someone had to figure out what happened to those kids. A week later, the bodies were found. Well, what was left of them? They were scattered through the woods, mauled, torn apart like roadkill. But it wasn't animals. No animal could do that. I know what we saw that day wasn't human, but nobody else does. Nobody else will. The thing that lives in Fox Hollow Woods, it's still out there and it's not done yet. My name is Dennis Sanders, 8.3. I'm 35 years old, and this happened in October of 2024. I've always loved exploring off the beaten path destinations in my RV, documenting my trips for the travel blog I've been running for years. My niche is spooky or unusual locations, haunted campgrounds, forgotten ghost towns, that sort of thing. This time, my curiosity led me to Whitewater State Park in southeastern Minnesota. It's a beautiful place, all rolling bluffs, hardwood forests, and limestone cliffs, but it's also known for its Native American burial mounds and the strange stories surrounding them. Disappearances, sightings of ghostly figures, and warnings not to disturb the land. I thought I'd debunk the myths like I usually do. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived at Whitewater, the weather was perfect, crisp air, the trees glowing with red and gold leaves, and just enough breeze to make the woods feel alive. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a trailhead, far enough from other campers to enjoy some peace and quiet. The first person I met was Jim Miller, a ranger who manned the visitor center. He was in his mid-50s, stocky, with a sun-weathered face and sharp blue eyes. Jim struck me as one of those people who know everything there is to know about their patch of land. "You're here to write about the mounds, aren't you?" he said, eyeing the camera slung around my neck. I smiled. "You caught me." Jim frowned, leaning on the counter. "You do well to leave them alone. The mounds aren't just old dirt, they're sacred, and folks who mess with them, well, things tend to go wrong." "Things like what?" Jim hesitated, glancing out the window as if he expected someone to overhear. "Strange noises, people getting lost, sometimes worse. Last year, a college kid went missing after camping near Spirit's Rise. Never found a trace of him. I felt a chill but brushed it off. I'll be careful." He sighed, then handed me a trail map. "Stick to the marked paths, and if you hear someone calling your name out there, don't answer." I laughed nervously. Got it. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked some trails, took photos of the river winding through the valley, and noted a few spots where I could set up my tripod for sunrise shots. By evening, I was back in my RV, cozy with a bowl of soup and my notes. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard a soft tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my heart racing. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bird or a curious raccoon, but the tapping came again, louder this time, and when I glanced at the window, I swore I saw a faint shadow move across it. "Who's there?" I called out, fumbling for my flashlight. There was no reply, just the rustling of leaves outside. When I mustered the courage to peek out, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind and went back to bed, though I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to hike to Spirits Rise, the largest and most infamous burial mound in the park. Jim's warning nagged at me, but I couldn't resist. If I wanted to write a good story, I needed photos. The trail was beautiful, but eerily quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels rustled through the underbrush. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the mound, I was struck by its sheer presence. It wasn't just a hill. It felt alive, as though the ground was pulsing faintly beneath my feet. A ring of old oaks surrounded it, their twisted branches casting long shadows. I raised my camera to take a photo, but the screen flickered and went black. I muttered a curse, fiddling with the buttons, but it wouldn't turn back on. That's when I heard the whisper. Matthew. It was faint, barely audible over the breeze, but unmistakable. My name. I spun around, searching for the source, but the trail was empty. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Feeling a sudden wave of unease, I turned and hurried back down the trail, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel. But the further I walked, the more the path seemed to change. The twists and turns didn't match what I remembered. My GPS showed nothing but a spinning icon. By the time I found my way back to the RV, the sun was low in the sky and my nerves were shot. I tried to shake off the fear and focusing instead on making dinner and organizing my notes. But that night, the knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was on the door. I froze, gripping the edge of the table. Who is it? No reply, just another knock, louder this time. My hand trembled as I grabbed the flashlight and swung the door open. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. The campsite was empty, the woods silent. As I backed into the RV, I noticed something chilling. A single handprint on the window, small like that of a child. The next morning, I sought out Jim, desperate for answers. He listened quietly as I described the whispers, the knocking, the handprint. "You went to Spirits Rise, didn't you?" he said, his voice flat. I nodded, guilt bubbling in my chest. "You disturbed them," he said. "You've been marked." "Marked for what?" Jim shook his head. "The spirits protect the mounds. Sometimes they warn people to leave. Sometimes." He trailed off, his gaze distant. "You need to give something back. An offering, flowers, a token, anything to show respect." I didn't fully believe him, but what choice did I have? That evening, I returned to Spirits Rise with a small bundle of wildflowers and an old bracelet that had belonged to my mother. I wasn't sure what to do, so I placed them at the base of the mound and murmured an apology. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew heavy, and the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. I turned to leave, but a figure blocked the path. It was a boy, no older than 10, with pale skin and hollow eyes. He stared at me, his mouth moving soundlessly. "Are you lost?" I managed to whisper. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he pointed to the mound, his expression blank. When I looked back at him, he was gone. That night, the activity escalated. I was jolted awake by a loud crash, concat, as though something had struck the side of the RV. My flashlight flickered erratically as I scanned the interior. The air felt icy, my breath visible in the dim light. Then I saw him again. The boy stood in the corner of the RV, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lips moved, but no sound came out. When I stepped toward him, his face twisted into a horrifying scream, and he vanished, leaving behind a faint trail of frost. I knew I couldn't stay another night. At dawn, I packed up and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panicking, I grabbed my map and decided to hike back to the visitor center, hoping to find Jim. But the forest had other plans. The trail warped around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my jacket. The whispers became a cacophony, drowning out my thoughts. And then I saw it. A clearing filled with old belongings, rusted lanterns, broken tents, and even a weathered RV overtaken by moss. In the center stood a stone altar, dark and slick, as though something had recently been spilled there. The boy's voice cut through the chaos. "Help me." He stood by the altar, his pale hand reaching out. I wanted to run, but my feet carried me forward. As I approached, the air grew colder, and a shadow began to rise from the altar. It was tall, featureless, and radiating a malevolent energy that made my chest tighten. The boy disappeared, replaced by the shadow, which advanced on me, its form shifting like smoke. Heart pounding, I fumbled in my bag and pulled out the bracelet I'd brought earlier, holding it high. "I'm sorry. Please take it," I shouted. The shadow paused, its form wavering. Slowly, it retreated, dissolving into the cold air. The whispers faded. When I stumbled back to the visitor center hours later, Jim was gone. Another ranger told me there hadn't been a Jim Miller on staff in years. A plaque near the entrance listed his name. He'd vanished in the woods decades ago, presumed dead. I left Whitewater that day, swearing never to return. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. No spelling corrections were needed. The text was already spelled correctly. I pulled my RV into the secluded campsite just as the rain started. The drops pinged against the roof like tiny bullets, creating a rhythm that, under other circumstances, might have been calming. But as I stepped out into the chill, I felt anything but calm. The Columbia River Gorge was supposed to be beautiful, a place where you could lose yourself in nature and leave the chaos of the world behind. That's what I told myself when I agreed to take this assignment, a photography spread on the rare owls that called the gorge home. It wasn't just work. It was a way to connect with the wilderness my dad had loved so much. He'd been gone 3 months now, and I hadn't yet figured out how to deal with the silence he left behind. The gorge felt like a fitting tribute, the kind of place he'd have taken me as a kid, pointing out tracks in the dirt and birds in the canopy. But as I stood there, staring at the dark forest ahead, I felt more alone than ever. The first day wasn't so bad. The rain let up by mid-morning, and I managed to find a good spot to set up my camera near one of the gorge's many waterfalls. The cascading water was mesmerizing, its roar drowning out the world, and for a while I forgot about everything else. That was until I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it had a rhythm to it, a cadence, words I couldn't make out, but that felt intentional. I scanned the area, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. "Just your imagination," I muttered to myself, but the words didn't convince me. That night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, the rain came back with a vengeance. The RV rocked slightly in the wind, and the forest outside the windows turned into an impenetrable wall of black. I tried to focus on the images, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One shot in particular stood out, a photo of the waterfall. In the corner, faint but unmistakable, was a shadowy figure standing among the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, just the contrast of the water spray against the dark forest. But then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. At first, they seemed far off, but they grew louder, closer, circling the RV. I turned off the light and peered out the window, but all I saw was the rain. The footsteps stopped, but the unease stayed with me long after I'd crawled into bed. The next day, I ventured deeper into the forest, determined to shake off the previous night's paranoia. The gorge was breathtaking, its trails winding through dense greenery and past cliffs that offered stunning views of the river below. I lost myself in the work, snapping shots of moss-covered rocks and misty trees. That's when I found the carvings. They were etched into a cluster of boulders, that spiraling symbols that looked ancient. I ran my fingers over one, noting how smooth it felt, as if it had been worn down by centuries of wind and rain. At the center of the largest carving was a stone, perfectly round and black as night. It almost seemed to pulse when I touched it. I pocketed the stone without thinking. Something about it felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. The forest felt heavier on the way back to the RV, the air thick with humidity and something else I couldn't name. As I neared camp, I spotted a figure in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. The man didn't move. I took a step closer, but as I did, the figure dissolved into the shadows. My pulse quickened. I hurried back to the RV and locked the door behind me. That night, the rain stopped, but the forest outside was anything but quiet. The whispers came back, louder this time, accompanied by faint laughter. And then I heard his voice. "Ethan." It was my dad, clear as day. "Dad?" I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Come here," the voice beckoned. It was coming from outside, pulling me toward the trees. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. A part of me knew it couldn't be real, knew that opening that door would be a mistake. But the voice was so familiar, so comforting. It took every ounce of willpower I had to stay inside. The next morning, I woke to find the RV surrounded by a circle of stones. They were identical to the one I'd pocketed, each one perfectly smooth and black. My stomach dropped. As I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The forest was silent, no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. And then I saw it. It stood on a rock, its form shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture too still. Its eyes glowed faintly like embers in a dying fire. "Leave what you took," the figure said, its voice gravelly, deep, and laced with menace. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. What are you?" The figure tilted its head as if studying me. "Leave what you took," it repeated before fading into the trees. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I considered leaving, but the RV's battery was dead and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I was trapped. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows outside the RV seemed to move, twisting and contorting into impossible shapes. I clutched the black stone in my hand, suddenly certain it was the key to everything. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, stepping outside and holding the stone aloft. The Sandman appeared again, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "Leave what you took," it said, its voice echoing through the gorge. I threw the stone into the forest, my chest heaving. The Sandman didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the cliffs. "Come," it whispered. I didn't follow. Instead, I bolted back into the RV and slammed the door. The Sandman's form loomed outside, but it didn't approach. Instead, it simply stared, its eyes burning into me. Somehow, I managed to jumpstart the RV. The next morning, as I drove out of the gorge, the weight that had pressed on me for days began to lift. But the memory of the Sandman stayed with me, its whispers echoing in my mind. Weeks later, as I developed my photos, I found something chilling in one shot, a stunning image of an owl perched on a branch. There was a shadow in the background, tall, humanoid, with glowing eyes. I haven't returned to the gorge since, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again. "Leave what you took." This happened in late November during the last stretch of a solo photography trip. I'll never forget it. My name is Grant Miller, and I'm 40 years old. I've spent most of my adult life chasing the perfect shot, the kind of photo that makes people stop and see the world differently. But over the last few years, the spark has been fading. The photographs all felt the same, and I started to wonder if my best work was behind me. That's why I went to Red Lake Wildlife Management Area, a sprawling wetland in northwestern Minnesota. I'd heard it was stunning, a place where nature seemed untouched by time. I wanted isolation, inspiration, and maybe a few shots to reinvigorate my portfolio. What I found instead was something I still can't explain. I pulled into the park late in the afternoon. The lot was empty, except for a small, rusty sedan near the visitor kiosk. A middle-aged man with a worn jacket and a trucker cap stood leaning against it, sipping from a thermos. "You heading into the marshes?" he asked as I stepped out of my RV. His voice had a rough edge, the kind that comes from years of cigarettes or shouting into the wind. "Thinking about it," I said, grabbing my camera bag. He squinted at me, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Be careful out there. Strange things happen in those wetlands, especially this time of year." "What kind of strange things? The kind you don't want to meet. Ever hear about the devil's song?" I shook my head, half smiling. "Nope, but it sounds like the setup to a good campfire story." His expression didn't change. "It ain't a story. Folks around here know better than to listen. If you hear music, you walk the other way, and if you see something following you—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, it's best not to see it at all." I laughed nervously, more out of politeness than amusement, and thanked him for the warning. As I drove into the park, his words lingered in my mind. I found a secluded spot near the wetlands to park the RV. The view was breathtaking, reeds swaying gently in the breeze, the golden light of sunset reflecting off the still water. The marsh stretched out like a painting, dotted with clusters of skeletal trees that reached for the sky like twisted fingers. I set up my gear and snapped a few photos. As the sun dipped lower, the camera felt good in my hands, familiar and grounding. For a moment, I forgot about the man's warning and lost myself in the work. But as twilight deepened, the stillness of the marsh began to unnerve me. There was no wind, no chirping of crickets or rustling of small animals, just an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional splash of water too far away to see. That's when I heard it. A melody, soft and distant, drifting through the air like smoke. It was hauntingly beautiful, the kind of sound that pulls at something deep inside you. At first, I thought it was coming from a bird or maybe someone playing music at another campsite, but as I listened, I realized it wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around me. I dismissed it as my imagination and went to bed early, but the melody followed me into my dreams. I woke in a sweat, the song echoing in my ears like the hum of a tuning fork. The next morning, I shook it off and decided to hike deeper into the marshes. If I could capture the stillness, the isolation of this place, maybe it would spark something in me. As I trudged through the reeds, the melody returned, faint but unmistakable. It sounded different this time, almost familiar. The further I walked, the clearer it became, weaving together fragments of music from my past. The lullaby my grandmother used to sing, the song my ex-wife played on repeat when we first started dating. By the time I reached a clearing in the wetlands, the melody had grown louder. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, pressing against me like an invisible hand. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin with no discernible features. His form seemed to shimmer like heat rising off pavement. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. I fumbled for my camera, snapping a few shots to prove to myself later that this was real. But when I lowered the lens, the figure was gone. Back at the RV, I reviewed the photos. The figure wasn't there. Every shot showed the clearing exactly as it had been, empty, desolate, untouched. That night, the melody grew louder. It didn't just float through the air this time, it invaded the RV, vibrating through the walls like the hum of a distant engine. I tried covering my ears, but it didn't help. Then the fog started. It rolled in thick and fast, wrapping around the RV until I couldn't see a foot beyond the windows. Shapes moved within it, flickering like shadows on a screen. My heart pounded as I caught glimpses of something tall and angular circling the RV. I stayed inside all night, too scared to move. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, as though something impossibly heavy had walked through the clearing. I decided to leave, but when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. The melody swelled, a taunting, mocking sound that seemed to laugh at my frustration. With no other option, I grabbed my gear and headed back into the wetlands, hoping to find help or at least a signal for my phone. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The reeds seemed taller, the water darker, the trees more gnarled. The air grew heavy, making each step feel like wading through thick mud. Eventually, I stumbled upon an abandoned hunting cabin, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Inside, I found a journal covered in mildew, the pages brittle with age. The entries were written in a shaky hand, detailing the story of a hunter who had come to the marshes decades ago. He'd heard the melody just as I had and followed it to its source, a deal with something he called the Shadow Man. The melody promised success, fame, everything the hunter desired, but the cost was his soul. The final entry read, "He follows me now. I hear the song every day. I am his, and soon you will be too." I heard a creak behind me and froze. Turning slowly, I saw the Shadow Man standing in the doorway. He was taller now, more solid, his featureless face tilted as though he were studying me. The melody swelled to a deafening crescendo as he stepped closer, his long, spindly fingers reaching out. "No!" I shouted, stumbling backward. I grabbed a flare from my bag and struck it. The red light cast eerie shadows across the cabin. The Shadow Man recoiled, his form flickering like a dying flame. Without thinking, I ran. The melody chased me through the marshes, twisting and warping into something monstrous. It wasn't music anymore. It was a scream, a cacophony of voices clawing at my mind. I reached the edge of the wetlands and saw it, a gnarled tree rising from the water, its bark blackened and twisted. The melody seemed to emanate from it, vibrating through the air like a pulse. With shaking hands, I struck another flare and hurled it at the tree. The flames caught instantly, racing up the trunk as the Shadow Man appeared at its base, writhing in agony. The song shifted into a final piercing wail before falling silent. I staggered back to the RV and half expecting it to still be dead, but when I turned the key, the engine roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the flames still burning in the distance. The melody was gone, but the silence it left behind was almost worse. Even now, I sometimes hear faint echoes of that song in the back of my mind, and when I do, I drive faster. My name is Ellie Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I write for a travel magazine. This happened last October when I took my RV to Devil's River State Natural Area in Texas to research a piece for an article called Hidden Gems of Texas. I thought I was prepared for the isolation, the wilderness, and even the eerie stories about the place. I was wrong. What I experienced there still haunts me. I arrived late in the afternoon, my RV kicking up a cloud of dust as I drove along the unpaved road to the campground. Devil's River was stunning. Crystal clear water winding through rocky terrain, flanked by sprawling desert vegetation. The remoteness was exactly what I was looking for. No cell service, no crowds, just nature in its purest form. After parking in a designated spot near the river, I stepped out to stretch and breathe in the crisp, dry air. That's when a sheriff's vehicle rolled up beside me. The man inside, a stocky, middle-aged man in a tan uniform, stepped out and tipped his hat. "You must be the writer," he said, his voice steady but friendly. "I'm Sheriff Hank Moreno. Just wanted to check in, make sure you're set up okay." "Thanks," I said, brushing dust off my jeans. "Just got here. It's beautiful." "It is," he replied, his expression softening, "but it's also dangerous if you're not careful. This place gets real dark at night, and the river is deeper than it looks. Stick to the trails and don't wander too far after sundown." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, forcing a smile. "Good," he said, tipping his hat again before climbing back into his vehicle. "Welcome to Devil's River." As I set up my RV, I noticed another camper about 100 yards away. She had a small tent pitched by the river and a collection of gear that suggested she was staying longer than me. She waved as I passed, and I decided to introduce myself. "Hey, I'm Ellie," I said, "here for the weekend." The woman smiled, brushing her curly hair out of her face. "Becky Turner. I'm here for as long as it takes." "As long as what takes?" I asked. "The Devil's Light," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "You've heard of it, right?" I shrugged. "Something about a glowing light?" The sheriff didn't mention it. Becky nodded, her smile widening. "It's an old legend. People say it's a spirit that lures travelers into the wilderness. Some call it a will-o'-the-wisp. Others say it's the devil himself. I'm here to find out. I tried not to laugh. So you're a ghost hunter? Amateur paranormal investigator, she corrected. And Devil's River is one of the most active spots in Texas. I nodded politely, but her enthusiasm bordered on absurd. Still, she seemed harmless enough. That night, I set up my camera to capture the stars. The sky here was unlike anything I'd seen before, a vast canvas of shimmering light. Around midnight, as I adjusted the exposure, something caught my eye. A faint flickering light danced across the river. At first, I thought it was another camper's lantern, but it moved too smoothly, too deliberately. I grabbed my zoom lens and focused on the light. It appeared to hover above the water, shifting between white, yellow, and a strange bluish-green hue. "Ellie!" Becky's voice called out behind me, startling me. I turned to see her jogging toward me, flashlight in hand. "Did you see it?" she asked breathlessly. "The light?" I asked. "Yeah. What is it?" Becky's grin widened. "It's the devil's light. We have to follow it." I frowned. "Follow it? Isn't that the whole thing? People who follow it disappear." "That's the legend," she said. "But I'm here to figure out what's really going on. It's probably just gas or reflections, but imagine if it's something more." I hesitated, then shook my head. "I'm staying here. Good luck." Becky looked disappointed but nodded. "Suit yourself." She headed toward the river, her flashlight bouncing with each step. I watched her disappear into the darkness, my unease growing. The next morning, I ran into Sheriff Moreno while hiking to a scenic overlook. He seemed relieved to see me still in one piece. "I see," he said. "Of course," I replied, though my tone lacked conviction. "Do you know anything about the Devil's Light?" His face darkened. "It's just a story, but I've had to search for enough people who went missing out here to know there's something off about this place. Stay close to camp, Ellie. Don't go chasing things you don't understand." I wanted to argue, to insist that I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but something about his tone stopped me. I nodded and promised to be careful. That evening, I sat by the river, scribbling notes for my article. The light returned, brighter and closer this time. It moved along the water's surface, then stopped, hovering just above the far bank. "Becky?" I called, but there was no answer. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to her campsite, only to find it abandoned. Her tent was still there, along with her equipment, but Becky was gone. Panic rose in my chest. "Becky!" I shouted into the night, my voice echoing across the canyon. The light flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard her voice. "Ellie, help me!" Without thinking, I stepped into the river, the cold water soaking my boots as I waded toward the sound. The further I walked, the brighter the light became, until it enveloped me entirely. I stopped, shielding my eyes, and realized I wasn't alone. Figures emerged within the light, shadows of people, their faces hollow and spectral. They reached out to me, their hands translucent and trembling. "Help us," they whispered in unison, their voices layered with desperation. I turned to run, but the water dragged at my legs, holding me in place. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with long, wet hair clinging to her face. It was Becky. "Ellie, please," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't leave me." "Becky," I whispered, my throat dry. Her face twisted, her eyes darkening. "Stay with us," she said, her voice overlapping with the others. "Forever." Fear surged through me, and I fought against the water's grip. The light pulsed, growing brighter and hotter, as if it were alive. "No," I screamed, pulling myself free and stumbling back toward the shore. The whispers grew louder, turning into wails that echoed in my skull. When I reached the riverbank, the light disappeared, plunging the area into silence. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my heart pounding. The next morning, Sheriff Moreno found me packing up my RV. I told him Becky was missing, and he nodded grimly. "Another one," he muttered under his breath. I debated telling him about the light, about the voices, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. Instead, I handed him Becky's journal, which I'd found near her tent. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the light flicker behind me. I haven't written about Devil's River. Some stories aren't meant to be shared. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the light and the whispers return. And I wonder if Becky's still out there, waiting for someone else to answer her call. My name is Grayson Richmond, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in late October 2022 during what should have been a routine stop for my freelance travel blog. I was in Big Bog State Recreation Area in northern Minnesota researching for an article about hidden gems in the Midwest. I never expected it to be the last trip I'd take by myself or the one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I arrived at Big Bog early in the afternoon, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs as I parked my rented RV in a secluded camping spot. It was off-season, and I had the area almost entirely to myself. That's how I liked it. Quiet, peaceful, the perfect place to write and gather inspiration. The bog stretched out endlessly beyond the marked trails, a sprawling wilderness of tall grasses and mirror-like water. It was beautiful in its darkness, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. The park ranger I'd spoken to earlier, Joan, had warned me about sticking to the main trails. "This bog can be unforgiving," she'd said, her tone more serious than I expected. "Stay out of the deep areas, especially at night. You don't want to end up like the others." I'd laughed it off at the time, assuming she was trying to spook me, but the way her eyes lingered on mine, the lines on her face tightening, told me there might be more to her words than I realized. After setting up camp, I decided to explore one of the marked trails near the bog. My GPS was acting up, something about weak satellite signals, but the trail was well maintained and I didn't think I needed it. The bog smelled of damp earth and decaying vegetation, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the tall grass. About an hour in, I spotted something off the trail. It was subtle at first, just a break in the brush, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the thicket and stumbled upon what looked like the ruins of an old homestead. A crumbling stone foundation was all that remained of the structure, half sunken into the marshy ground. Nearby, I found something that made my skin prickle. A rusted doll, its porcelain face cracked but still smiling, and a faded black and white photograph lying half buried in the dirt. The photo showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of what must have been the same cabin, though intact and whole in the picture. There was something off about their expressions, though, especially the children. They weren't smiling like you'd expect. Their faces looked solemn, almost scared. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as a trick of the atmosphere. I slipped the photo into my jacket pocket for safekeeping. It would make for a great addition to my article, a piece of history tied to the bog's mysterious past. That night, as I sat in my RV typing notes, the first strange thing happened. The lights flickered briefly, and I heard a faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just tree branches rushing against the glass, but when I stepped outside to check, there was nothing there. The trees were too far from the RV for anything to have reached it. I told myself it was just my imagination and went to bed. The next morning, I woke to find my laptop had died, despite being fully charged the night before. My phone's battery had drained too, and the generator was sputtering like it was on its last legs. It wasn't a huge deal. I could make do without technology for a while, but it was inconvenient. I decided to explore further, hoping to shake off the strange unease that had settled over me. As I walked deeper into the bog, a dense fog began to roll in, muffling the world around me. The silence was absolute, almost oppressive. That's when I heard it, faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I stopped, straining to listen, but they faded as quickly as they'd come. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish as my voice broke the stillness. Of course, there was no response. I chalked it up to the wind playing tricks on me and kept walking. About halfway through the hike, I reached a clearing where the bog opened up into a shallow pool of water. The surface was so still, it looked like glass. As I stared at it, I thought I saw movement, A ripple, then a shadow, like something just beneath the surface. My heart thudded, but when I stepped closer, there was nothing there. When I got back to the RV that evening, I realized something unsettling. The doll I'd left near the ruins was now sitting on the steps of the RV. At first, I thought maybe I'd accidentally packed it with me, but the memory of leaving it behind was vivid. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavier than it should, as if it were waterlogged. I tossed it into a storage bin, trying not to think about it. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was standing in the ruined cabin, but it was whole again, the walls intact, and the air thick with the smell of damp wood. The children from the photo were there, playing in the corner. They turned to look at me, their faces pale and expressionless. "Stay with us," one of them said in a soft, lilting voice. The other reached out her hand, cold and wet, like she had just pulled it from the fog. I woke up gasping, my clothes soaked with sweat. The RV felt stifling, as though the air had been sucked out of it. When I glanced at the window, I froze. There was a handprint on the glass, small and smudged like a child's. By the fourth day, I was ready to leave. My nerves were shot, and the RV was barely functioning, but as I started packing, I felt an inexplicable pull to return to the cabin ruins. It was as if something was calling me, drawing me back. Against my better judgment, I went. The bog seemed darker than before, the air heavier. When I reached the ruins, the atmosphere was suffocating. I took out the photograph and held it up, studying the faces again. That's when I heard a voice, soft, melodic, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Grayson," it whispered, "why did you come here?" I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to shift, though, coalescing into a figure. It was the mother from the photo, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes like black pits. She stepped closer, and I realized I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, my breath shallow. "You'll stay," she said, her voice echoing in my head. "You'll stay with us." A cold, suffocating presence washed over me, and I felt myself slipping. My mind blurred, and for a moment I was back in the cabin, the walls closing in around me. The children laughed, their voices sharp and cruel, their hands grabbing at me. In a desperate burst of will, I remembered the doll. I fumbled for it in my bag, pulling it out and hurling it into the ruins. The mother screamed, a horrible guttural sound that shook the ground. The shadows recoiled, and I felt the hold on me break. I ran. I didn't care about the trails or the fog. I ran until my legs burned, and the RV came into sight. Throwing myself inside, I started the engine and drove, not even bothering to secure my things. The bog blurred behind me as I sped down the narrow road, not stopping until I reached a nearby gas station. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I left the photo and doll behind, but sometimes I still feel their presence, like shadows lingering at the edges of my vision. And at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I hear whispers. If you ever visit Big Bog, be careful. Some places don't want to let you go. My name is Raymond Flores. I'm 42 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I was camping near Devil Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. It was supposed to be a simple solo trip, a chance to rediscover my love for geology and shake off the lingering bitterness of my divorce. Instead, I encountered something that I can only describe as evil, and it changed the way I see the world and myself. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon after a long and tedious drive over rocky back roads. My RV's tires groaned as I forced it through trails that probably weren't meant for anything larger than an ATV. By the time I reached the edge of the sinkhole, I'd bent a rim and lost an hour to backtracking when I took a wrong turn. Still, the view was worth it. The sinkhole stretched wide and deep in the rocky landscape, its black maw gaping under the pale Texas sky. The guidebook said it was 400 feet deep, and as I stood at the edge, staring into the void, I could believe it. Hundreds of bats emerged from the darkness, their wings slicing through the evening air like whispers of another world. I set up camp close by, just outside the official boundaries of the protected area. The no trespassing signs didn't bother me much. I wasn't planning to do anything destructive. I just wanted a good vantage point for studying the rock formations and maybe capturing some drone footage. It was the perfect spot for inspiration, or so I thought. The first strange thing happened as I unpacked my gear. I'd brought a high-end drone to get detailed images of the sinkhole's interior, but it refused to power on. I charged it the night before, but now the battery was dead. When I swapped it for a spare, the drone buzzed to life, only to lose connection as soon as I tried to fly it over the sinkhole. "Damn signal interference," I muttered, though I couldn't see anything nearby that might have caused it. I shoved the drone aside and grabbed my camera instead. As I set up my tripod, the bats began to swarm out of the sinkhole in greater numbers. I froze, staring as their flight pattern shifted into something unnervingly deliberate. For a moment, they seemed to form the shape of a hand, claws extended before scattering into the twilight. I laughed uneasily, shaking off the feeling. "Just my imagination," I said out loud, though the words rang hollow. That night, as I lay in my RV, the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. I was used to the stillness of remote camping, but this was different. It was too quiet, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Then the noises started. At first, it was just a faint groaning sound, like the wind rushing through the canyon. But as I listened, the groan turned into something deeper, almost like a voice. It was low and guttural, resonating from the direction of the sinkhole. "Raymond." I sat up straight, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was my name. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the area. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rocks and dry scrub. Still, the voice lingered in the back of my mind as though it had etched itself into my thoughts. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something unusual near the edge of the sinkhole. Partially buried in the dirt was an old weathered book. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were intact, filled with strange symbols and passages in a language I couldn't recognize. It looked ancient, and as I flipped through it, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The symbols seemed to shift on the page, their shapes warping and twisting as though they were alive. I should have left it there. I should have walked away, but curiosity got the better of me. I brought the book back to the RV, intending to research it later. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noises started again. This time, they were louder. "Raymond!" The voice was clearer now, echoing from the direction of the sinkhole. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, heavy and malevolent. I stepped outside, clutching my flashlight, and froze. Near the edge of the sinkhole stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with horns that curved against the sky and eyes that glowed like embers. "Who's there?" I called, though my voice wavered. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with those burning eyes. Then it raised one clawed hand and pointed to the book sitting on the RV's table. I backed away, my heart racing. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the echo of its voice. "Raymond?" The next few hours were a blur of panic and confusion. The voice grew louder, now coming from all around me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, too quick to catch but too real to ignore. The RV's lights flickered wildly, plunging me into darkness before flaring back to life. Desperate for answers, I grabbed the book and began flipping through its pages. The symbols seemed to pulse, their shapes growing sharper and more menacing. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of the cryptic passages, but the language was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Then the shadows became solid. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting and flickering like flames. They surrounded the RV, their eyes glowing red, their mouths whispering my name over and over. "Raymond, Raymond, Raymond." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the book and ran outside, the cold desert air biting at my skin. The figures closed in, their whispers growing into a deafening roar. "What do you want?" I screamed, clutching the book to my chest. The towering figure appeared again, rising from the sinkhole like a shadow brought to life. Its voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath my feet. "You disturbed my domain," it said, its words cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You brought the book. You must pay the price." Its clawed hand reached for me, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. Then I remembered something. A line from an old myth about curses and spirits. "Burn the tether and the curse will break." I didn't know if it would work, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my lighter, flicked it on, and held the flame to the book. The pages ignited, the fire spreading quickly as the symbols writhed and twisted in agony. The figures screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the book burned. The towering entity howled, its voice shaking the air before vanishing into the darkness. When it was over, I collapsed to the ground, trembling and gasping for breath. The desert was silent again. The oppressive weight lifted. I didn't wait for dawn. I packed up what I could and left the park, abandoning the RV when it refused to start. I don't know what I encountered at Devil's Sinkhole, but I'll never forget it. The images from that trip, the ones I managed to recover, show things I can't explain. Shadows that shouldn't be there, shapes that defy reason. I've shared my story with a few people, but most don't believe me. Maybe I don't want them to. Some truths are better left buried. My name is Mary Bryant, and I'm 32 years old. This happened last July when I joined my two closest friends for what was supposed to be a simple camping trip in Big Bend National Park. At the time, it seemed like the perfect way to escape the noise of the city. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life, one that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It started with Jake, of course. He was too much of a thrill seeker to his core, always itching for the next adventure. "Big Bend is practically made for us," he'd said over the phone, pitching the idea like a salesman. Hiking, stargazing, legends of ghosts and skinwalkers. It's got everything. Sam, the oldest at 31, was reluctant from the beginning. As a park ranger from another state, he had a respect for the wilderness that Jake never seemed to grasp. "This isn't some controlled trail in a state park," Sam warned. "If we're not careful, the Chisos Basin will chew us up and spit us out." I should have listened to him. We rented an old RV, the only one available on short notice, and drove for hours to the park. As soon as we hit the basin, I felt an uneasiness settle over me. The mountains rose like jagged teeth, their shadows stretching long and deep under the late afternoon sun. The isolation was palpable. No cell service, no sounds except the wind and the occasional call of a bird. The RV was already giving us trouble. The battery light flickered as we parked at the campsite, and the interior lights buzzed faintly. Jake waved it off, saying, "It'll hold. We're not driving it anywhere for a few days anyway." That night, we sat around the fire, trading stories. Jake was in his element, weaving tales about the supernatural. "Skinwalkers," he said, grinning wickedly. "Shapeshifters. They mimic voices to lure you away from safety. People go missing out here all the time, you know?" Sam shook his head. "That's Navajo folklore, not from around here." "Doesn't mean it can't happen," Jake shot back. I tried to laugh it off, but as the firelight danced across the surrounding trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first sign came in the middle of the night. I woke to a sound outside the RV, a low, guttural cry that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like an animal at first, maybe a coyote, but then it shifted, rising into a scream that almost sounded human. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, shaking Jake awake. He groaned. "It's just the wind, Emma. Go back to sleep." But it didn't feel like the wind. The next morning, I found tracks near the campsite. They were large, humanoid, but wrong, too deep, too elongated, with no visible tread or pattern. Sam frowned as he studied them. "Could be a bear," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Jake, of course, was delighted. "It's the skinwalker," he declared dramatically. "We're being hunted." "Don't joke about that," Sam snapped. We set off on a hike later that day, hoping to shake off the tension. The Chisos Mountains were breathtaking, with rugged peaks and sprawling desert views, but the further we went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. As we made our way back to the RV, I heard someone call my name. Emma, the voice said, soft and clear, coming from the woods to our left. I stopped in my tracks. Jake? I asked, turning to him. What? He said, walking right beside me. The voice called again. Emma, my blood ran cold. It was my name, but it didn't sound quite right, like someone trying to imitate it and failing, just enough to be unsettling. We need to go, Sam said, his voice low and urgent. That night, the RV felt like a prison. The battery was completely dead, leaving us with no lights except for a few weak flashlights. The fire outside barely seemed to keep the darkness at bay. Jake tried to lighten the mood, but even he seemed unnerved. The scratching started around midnight. At first, it was faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. Something or someone was clawing at the door. Stay quiet, his face pale. He grabbed the fire poker and stood by the door. We held our breath as the scratching stopped. A moment later, a voice called from outside. Sam, it said, perfectly mimicking Jake. Sam froze. Don't answer it, he hissed. Then it called again, this time mimicking me. Emma, let me in. Jake was the first to break. What the hell is out there? He demanded, moving toward the door. Don't, Sam warned, but Jake was already reaching for the handle. Before he could open it, a shadow passed across the small window. It was humanoid, but hunched, its limbs too long, its movement jerky and unnatural. The firelight outside caught its face, and I felt bile rise in my throat. It was trying to look human, but the features were twisted, stretched, wrong. Jake stumbled back, his bravado gone. What do we do? He whispered. Sam gripped the fire poker tightly. We wait. It'll leave if we don't give it what it wants. But the thing outside didn't leave. It circled the RV, tapping on the windows, its distorted voice calling out in turn for each of us. Every time it spoke, it sounded more grotesque, more inhuman. I felt the walls closing in. We can't just sit here, I said, panic rising in my chest. Sam looked at me, his expression grim. If we run, it'll pick us off one by one. We stay together. But the RV wasn't safe. The roof creaked under the weight of something heavy. The clawing returned, more frenzied this time. I clutched my camera, desperate for some sense of control. Without thinking, I snapped a photo of the window. The flash lit up the darkness, and for a split second, I saw it. The creature was perched just outside, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I screamed, and the thing let out a guttural shriek, retreating into the shadows. By dawn, the scratching had stopped, but the RV was in shambles. Deep claw marks scored the doors and windows. Sam made the call. We had to leave. The RV was no longer an option, so we packed what we could and set off on foot toward the nearest campsite. The fog was thick, muffling sounds and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow made my heart race. We were halfway down the trail when it struck. The creature burst from the trees, a blur of limbs and claws. It went straight for Sam, knocking him to the ground. Run, he yelled, swinging the fire poker wildly. Sam! I screamed, but Jake grabbed my arm and dragged me forward. Sam's screams echoed behind us, then fell abruptly silent. Jake and I stumbled into the next campsite hours later, bloodied and shaken. A group of hikers called for help, but by the time the rangers arrived, there was no sign of Sam or the creature. The official report listed him as missing, but I know the truth. Something ancient, something evil, took him in those mountains, and it's still out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping since.